would here at trading posts. Mules they transport. Nearly all of them died of sleeping sickness, a disease carried by the tsetse fly, and for which there was no known cure. To open up the country and put an end to this slave traffic, there was only one solution: a railway. In London, Sir William Mackinnon and his co-directors of the British East Africa Company read the reports from what a railway met with little support. That being the case, cut our losses was the verdict. The company must cease operations in East Africa. The project seemed doomed through lack of a railway. Orders were dispatched to the company in Uganda, instructing them to cease operations. Then Sir William had a call from representatives of the Church Missionary Society and other similar organizations. Fearing for their representatives in Africa, they offered to pay to keep the company's forces there under Captain Lugard for another year. This provided a vital breathing space. In Parliament, the fate of East Africa was debated. Lord Rosebery, Foreign Secretary in Gladstone's new government, pressed into taking action, wrote to Sir Gerald Portal, Britain's Consul General in Zanzibar Island, instructing him to frame a report as expeditiously as possible on the best means of dealing with the country. Sir Gerald Portal at once set off on the long journey across East Africa. Although no government finance had been forthcoming, there was an official survey team there who were mapping out a possible route for a railway. Captain MacDonald of the Royal Engineers was in charge of the survey. It was in May 1893 that these two men met. Sir Gerald was then only 35. On his way up from the coast, he had been studying the terrain carefully. MacDonald showed him the route of the proposed railway. He told him it was 657 miles from the coast to Lake Victoria. Based on MacDonald's survey, Sir Gerald framed his own report. He recommended that the British should stay in this part of Africa and that the heavy financial responsibility should fall on the government and not on a private company. As a result, on April the 12th, 1894, the world received this news. Press announcements that Lord Salisbury's government intended to spend £3 million on the railway provoked strong criticism. Mr. Labouchere, the Liberal MP for Northampton, vigorously opposed the bill, saying, "It is a railway which starts from nowhere and nobody wants to use it. It goes nowhere and nobody wants to come back by it." But that criticism got him precisely nowhere. Lord Salisbury, the Prime Minister, had his answer. This railway would be the most fatal blow to the slave trade which could possibly be delivered. So the money was granted, and in December 1895, the railway was begun at last. A base was established on Mombasa Island. For George Whitehouse, the chief engineer, the line was more than just a job, it was a mission. 657 miles had been the original estimate, and although a better route later reduced the mileage to 587, the lack of a local skilled labor force, housing facilities, machinery, and the incredibly difficult terrain over which the line must run made few Africans found to work on the line at that time, and labor from India, accustomed to railway building, had to be recruited. Construction gangs were continually faced with the problem of loose sand, thick African bush, indigenous forests, and outcrops of rock. But spurred on by the indomitable will and courage of George Whitehouse, slowly, painfully, the lunatic line, as its critics called it, crept inland. The African sun beat down on the workers. water holes were fouled and brackish, and the water had to be distilled. And if it was not the heat, it was the rain, drenching tropical rain. Disease was rife. Smallpox, malaria, dysentery, or tragedy came frequently to the men who built the permanent way. George Whitehouse was both engineer and missionary. With the patience of the pioneer, which was eventually to win him a knighthood, he struggled on undaunted. Men of all nations were laid to rest near the railway for which they gave their lives. But to George Whitehouse, every life lost was a bitter blow to his personal sense of achievement in conquering the unknown. Eventually, the line left Mombasa 100 miles in the rear. It seemed that no new hazard could face the engineers as they forced their way westward. But then they came to Tsavo, and a new and terrible menace. To the man-eater Tsavo, scores of railway workers fell victim. Among the many tragic incidents at this time, perhaps the most fantastic of all was that at Kima on June the 6th, 1900. 3 men had searched all day for the lions without success. They were Charles Ryle, a superintendent in the railway police, Hübner, a German trader, and Parenti, an Italian trader. They planned to keep watch all night inside an inspection coach in the hope that the lion might appear and give them the chance of putting an end to this terror. had claimed yet another victim. The hunt for the man-eaters was intensified. At one time, all work had stopped on the railway for 3 weeks, so great was the danger. The construction engineers, men like Lieutenant Colonel Patterson, who had previously accounted for 2 of these man-eaters, carried on the hunt. They eventually put an end to this menace, which during the building of the railway had accounted for the lives of nearly 100 men. On May the 30th, 1899, the rails reached Nairobi. The site of Nairobi had been chosen solely because it was a convenient place for the establishment of railway workshops and a stores depot as a base for further construction towards Lake Victoria. Within a remarkably short time, a small township sprang up. Houses and stores, hotels and workshops were quickly built as more and more railwaymen established their homes in what was later to become the capital city of Kenya. In the 1890s, known then as German East Africa, where Kilimanjaro, Africa's highest mountain, reaches nearly 20,000 feet into the sky. Here the German invaders, for much the same reason as the British, were anxious to build railways into the hinterland, to open up this vast territory to civilization. The problem of slave trading was, if anything, even worse here than in British East Africa. The Germans also suffered terrible hardships. In 4 years, they had only struggled 40 kilometers inland from the coast. Once again, limited knowledge of medicines to combat the mysterious diseases which struck them down was to cause chaos and delay. It was not until 1902 that the railway line from Tanga to Karagwe in German East Africa was opened. Barely 50 miles of track laid in 11 years. In 1911, the line reached Moshi, 20 years after the Germans had started their survey. Back in Kenya, the great Rift Valley, 30 miles from Nairobi, faced the engineers. The railway had to negotiate this escarpment on its journey to Lake Victoria. George Whitehouse tackled the problem with his customary ingenuity and resource. He modeled a rope incline, simple in design but immensely difficult in construction, as a temporary means of lowering the materials for building the line across the floor of the rift, whilst a permanent but more winding route was built down the eastern wall. Trucks were hauled up and down this incline by wire ropes operated by a donkey engine. As the line reached across the Rift Valley to the west, there came a new threat. The Nandi, a fearless warrior tribe, greeted the arrival of the railway with delight. For the permanent way materials would meet their greatest need, metal. Mile after mile of solid iron for swords and spears. Mile after mile of telegraph wire for bangles and earrings. Never had the Nandi known such wealth. pilfering went on, seriously curtailing the progress of the railway. Finally, White House arranged a truce with the Nandi chief. But unfortunately, this truce was to be broken frequently. And then, at the turn of the century, and with the final goal almost in sight, came the rain, drenching, penetrating rain. For 3 months, the rain streamed down. Work came to a complete standstill. Thousands of pounds worth of damage was done. Over this scene of melancholy desolation came the sun. But at last, December the 20th, 1901, the day of achievement. Into Port Florence, later to be known as Kisumu, on the shores of Lake Victoria, steamed the first train. Almost 6 years to the day after the line had been started, 587 miles across Africa at its wildest. The rails had reached out, and now they were at their goal. For George Whitehouse, this was the moment of his greatest triumph. The Uganda Railway, built against all odds, was a reality. The news reached London. The Times reported that the laying of the rails of the Uganda Railway had been completed in less than 5.5 years. The news was received almost incredulously. The goal had been reached. The railway now stretched from the coast to the shores of Lake Victoria. In fact, of course, Port Florence was not in Uganda, and it may seem strange that what was known as the Uganda Railway did not in fact reach that country. In those days, the last stage of the journey across Lake Victoria was by steamer to Jinja and Port Bell. For many years, these steamers, brought here in pieces and assembled on the lake shore, provided the vital link between Uganda and the outside world. At a final cost of nearly £8 million, the lunatic line, instead of being a laughingstock, was a railway to be proud of. The lives of the surveyors, workers and engineers which had been lost, the passionate devotion of the chief engineer to his incredible task, the ingenuity, hardships, earth-slugging courage had not been in vain. These railway pioneers, but the way was far from permanent. The initial hardships were over, but at least 2 years' work remained, making good the workmanship, building new lines where temporary deviations had been hurriedly laid. In 1907, the Under-Secretary of State for the Colonies arrived at Port Florence to see for himself what he described as one of the most wonderful railways in the world. His name, the Right Honourable Winston Churchill. Colonel Sir James Hayes Saturn, Governor of Kenya, escorted Mr. Churchill, who was to write later,
"It is easy, as one traverses in 48 hours, countries which ignorance and astonishing conditions plunged the pioneers through everything, through forests, through ravines, through prides of marauding lions, through famine, through war, through 5 years of excoriating parliamentary debate, marched the railway. And here it is at last, arrived at its goal. And the Uganda Railway is doing what it was never expected within a reasonable period to do. It is paying its way. It has already achieved a commercial value. And this is but a beginning.
German East Africa, another formidable project, the Central Line, was meanwhile built from Dar es Salaam inland. In 1907, 2 years after work began, it had reached Morogoro, and by 1914, the line of the Mittellandbahn finally reached Kigoma on Lake Tanganyika, nearly 800 miles from the coast. The Germans soon set about developing the territory opened up by the railway. They introduced sisal from Florida, later to become one of the country's most valuable exports. As in German East Africa, so in British East Africa, did the railway prove the vast possibilities of the rich country through which the line passed. Millions of acres which, properly farmed, could bring prosperity to a country, many of whose people still lived in primitive conditions and poverty. The vast open spaces of this new country soon attracted immigrant farmers. They came with their families and their simple possessions in the wake of the newly built railway. Years of hard toil and in some cases heartbreaking failure lay ahead of them. They knew what their future would be, but they were part of the new spirit of a new Africa. Bush and scrub had to be cut back to make room for the crops they were to plant. Grass houses had to be built to provide temporary accommodation. And all around them were new dangers. The settlers found, however, that neighboring Africans were friendly, cooperative, and willing to learn. Medical knowledge, crude and limited in the beginning, nevertheless quickly cut the infant mortality rate. Lord Delamere, East Africa's great farming pioneer, became the farmers' leader, and under his guidance were laid the foundations of the flourishing farming industry. Back in England, the House of Commons heard the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Mr. Lloyd George, say,
"No doubt at all about the enormous possibilities of this great country. There has been an increase from year to year in the produce which comes from this quarter."
And so the British government granted more money towards the development of the railway to provide refinements and services so badly needed. The First World War brought only a temporary halt to the development of East Africa and the progress of the railway. When the war ended, German East Africa became a League of Nations trust territory under British administration and was renamed Tanganyika. Then in 1928, Mwanza, on the southeastern shore of Lake Victoria, received the first train from Tabora, and another vital link was forged in the great chain of communication. Tabora as the junction, there was now a rail service between Lakes Victoria and Tanganyika. Sir Christian Felling, General Manager of the Kenya and Uganda Railway, was in charge of a similar operation of tremendous expansion, helped by his chief engineer, who was to succeed him as General Manager, Brigadier General Sir Godfrey Rhodes. Many new lines were added to the system. But Sir Christian Felling's devotion to the railway undermined his health. He had been warned in London that a return to Africa might prove fatal. But such was his desire to promote the progress of the railway that he ignored his doctor's advice. On August the 19th, 1928, Sir Christian Felling died of malaria. The late 20s and early 30s were years of depression in East Africa. Swarm upon swarm of locusts came in to devastate the crops. Then a terrible drought. And at almost the same time, a worldwide depression started by the Wall Street crash brought lean years to the railways and the East African countries. Whenever it seemed that recovery might be in sight, some new crisis would develop to dash all hopes. The years 1937 and 38 brought a measure of recovery, including increased crops of cotton, tea, maize, and coffee. But then, in 1939, came war. To East Africa came Commonwealth troops, and from it to battle fronts went her men and women. And when the fighting was over and peacetime schedules were restored again, the railways were soon running through territories that were quickly heading for prosperity. More and more acres of land were prepared for cultivation. Agriculture developed as the demand for East Africa's produce grew. Wheat, originally pioneered with such courage by Lord Delamere, flourished as never before. Sisal, for years a vital part of Tanganyika's economy, was in worldwide demand. Coffee, particularly that being grown in Kenya, has taken its place in recent years among the world's best. African farmers, encouraged by government agricultural experts, are now playing an ever-increasing part in coffee production. Pineapples and other fruits from East Africa are exported often by air to all corners of the globe. Cotton, for many years a major export of Uganda, is a cornerstone of the country's economy. Sugar is grown in increasing quantities to meet local needs. Livestock is of the highest quality, and dairy farming is a major industry of Kenya. Bacon, comparable to the world's best, goes far beyond the continent of Africa. Pyrethrum, the extract of which is used for the manufacture of deadly insecticides, is widely exported. Tea, grown in the wet, high areas of East Africa, is now a flourishing industry employing many thousands. To process the tea, factories. To process the grain, mills. Industry is moving into the plains of Africa. New housing estates bring comfort and happiness to railway employees and others engaged in industry. Thus do all the peoples of East Africa benefit from the territory's expanding economy. In 1948, the amalgamation of the Kenya and Uganda Railway with the railways of Tanganyika to form the East African Railways and Harbours system was symbolic of the economic collaboration of the three territories. Today, a network of railways link an area 7.5 times the size of Great Britain, an area of remarkable contrast that draws thousands of visitors from overseas each year. Modern steamers ply on Victoria. The East African line is fast becoming one of the world's favorite playgrounds. Modern luxury hotels await the tourist, offering incomparable service and holiday facilities. But it is the wildlife of East Africa, preserved in its natural state, that provides the greatest attraction. hunter or photographer, no place on earth can offer such a profusion of game, living as it has always lived, by laws unchanged since the beginning of time. Of contrast, for modern to the last degree is Mombasa's Kilindini harbour, through which pours Kenya's and Uganda's exports and imports. Oil tankers bring their vital cargoes to Mombasa with fuel for the railway and to keep the wheels of the hurriedly expanding industries of these new territories turning. Serving Tanganyika is another modern harbour. The deepwater berths and other developments of the 20th century have made Dar es Salaam, capital of Tanganyika, a modern city. The name Dar es Salaam was given to the harbour centuries ago by Arab traders. It means haven of peace. Kampala, the commercial capital of Uganda, is ringed by 7 hills, most of which are surmounted by churches of various denominations and a mosque. Kampala was the terminus of the Kenya and Uganda section of the railway until 1956, when the 208-mile western Uganda extension was opened to Kasese, over 1,000 miles from Mombasa. This station stands close to the Ruwenzori Mountains, originally named the Mountains of the Moon by Ptolemy nearly 2,000 years ago. In the foothills of these mountains are found rich deposits of copper and cobalt. The crude ore mined here is converted into copper concentrates, which are carried by rail over the western Uganda extension to the smelting plant at Jinja. The electricity for the plant is provided by the giant Owen Falls Dam, which harnesses the power of the River Nile. From the same source, electricity feeds many industries in Uganda and Kenya, reaching as far as Nairobi, Kenya's capital, known as the City in the Sun. Years ago, a single railway track and a few workers' hutments. Today, a place of importance on the map of the world. Nairobi's modern airport stands at the crossroads of Africa to welcome businessmen and tourists. And the railway to Nairobi and indeed East Africa owes its very existence, is keeping pace with the country's progress. Medical science has moved in to combat the sickness and diseases that once scourged Africa. Doctors and nurses of all races work together to improve the health of the peoples of East Africa. Makerere College in Uganda has the status of a university and stands as a fine example of the development of education in East Africa. The Royal College, Nairobi, provides university training for students in engineering, art, commerce, and other specialist subjects. Building for the future is the task of the East African Railway's training schools, where students learn how to be efficient railwaymen. Experts teach these young men the wide variety of trades necessary for the safe and efficient running of a modern railway system. The story of East Africa's permanent way began at the turn of the century. It is the story of remarkable foresight, superlative courage and administrative wisdom. It is a story that does not end. For as the years pass, the network stretches further and yet further across the three territories. Along this iron road flows an abundance of Africa's produce to the world, and from the world returns the knowledge, experience, and learning of the 20th century to the very heart of the youthful, vigorous continent of modern Africa.